I woke up at 60 in the water. In a chair, I sat in the water for 8 years, and told myself I was going to end my son the second he walked through that door with his lawyer. I had bank statements printed on the kitchen table and a voice memo app already running in my flannel pocket, and everything I needed to bury him, and I used it, and it worked exactly like I planned. My name's Walt Odom. 64. I live outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, a town called Sand Springs, in a house my daddy built with his own hands in 1961. I want to tell you something before I go any further, and it's going to sound off. You're going to notice I talk slow. I'm going to talk slow the whole time I'm telling you this. It doesn't crack, it doesn't speed up, and I need you to know up front that's a voice I built on purpose. I've had it since 1988. It's the best tool I own, and I'm using it on you right now while I tell you what I did to my own boy. I'm sorry about that. It's the only voice I've got. I'm a courtroom bailiff. 31 years, Tulsa County District Court, Judge Everett Pruitt's room, 3rd floor. If you've ever sat in that gallery waiting on a verdict, you've heard me call a room to order. That voice is the reason 400 families didn't come apart at the worst moment of their lives, standing there when a jury foreman said the word guilty or the word not guilty, and somebody needed a steady hand telling them when to rise and when to sit. That's not bragging, that's a job description. That voice has done more good in this world than every other part of me combined, and I want that on the record before I tell you what I did with it in my own kitchen. Here's the thing nobody in this story wanted to hear first, so I'll give it to you now. My father built a cattle feed operation out of a barn on Highway 97, 4 locations by the time I was grown, and he wanted me to run it. That's the whole opening of my life right there. He wanted me to take it, and I didn't. Every story like mine, somebody wants to tell you the son had a dream, wanted to paint, wanted to sing. That's not what happened to me. What happened is, I married Carol Ann Pruitt in 1984, and her daddy was a judge, and he's the one who asked me. I was 22 years old. Everett Pruitt had me out on his back porch stringing lights for a graduation party, and he said, "Walt, you ever thought about working in a courtroom?" And nobody had ever asked me a question about my own life before that. My father built things and pointed at them and said, "That's yours, boy." He never once asked if I wanted the feed business. Where he was raised, a man hands his son a business, full stop, and the son takes it, and that's what love looked like out there. And then Everett Pruitt asked me a question on a back porch with a string of lights in his hand, and I went and found myself a different father. That's the plain truth of it. I didn't pick a career. I picked a man who asked instead of told. We had it out in his truck outside the feed store in 1984, maybe 9 minutes, engine running the whole time, and that was that. 42 years, 2 miles apart, my whole life. I want you to sit with that number, because it's the part of this story nobody understands until I say it slow. 2 miles, not across the country. Not a man who ran off somewhere with an excuse built into the distance. 2 miles from his front door to mine the entire time. I drove past his turnoff on 97 more Sundays than I could count. My father died this past February, 89 years old, in his recliner, and the hospice aide found him on a Wednesday morning. I found out from his lawyer, a man named Grady Beam, who'd handled Odom Feed for almost 40 years. He called my cell while I was standing at the bench waiting on a jury to file back in, and he said, "Walt, I hate to be the one." And I said, "I appreciate you calling, Grady." And I hung up and I called the room back to order, because there was a verdict coming and that's my job, and I did my job. I finished a full docket that day. There was a man waiting to hear if he was going to prison for 11 years, and I stood there and I did what I do, and I did not think about my father one time until 4:40 that afternoon when the courthouse emptied out. Then I sat in my truck in the parking garage for about half an hour, not crying. I want to be straight with you about that, because everybody expects the crying and it wasn't there. I was doing math. 42 years, 2 miles. I could not make that number make sense no matter how I turned it. I didn't go to the funeral. I've had 5 months to find polite ways around saying that plain, so let me just say it plain. I have stood next to more grieving families than I could count across 31 years in that courtroom, steadying grown men who couldn't hold themselves up when a verdict landed, and I did not go to my own father's funeral. Yoder and Sons handled it, out past Sepulpa, and old man Yoder called me himself the night before, professional courtesy, the way we all do it for each other in this line of work, sort of. He said, "Walt, it's tomorrow at 10. Wanted you hearing it from me." And I said, "Thank you for the call." And he waited. 4, maybe 5 seconds on that phone, holding the door open for me to say something else, and I knew exactly what he was doing because I've held that same door for people 1,000 times in a courtroom hallway. And I said, "I appreciate it, sir," and I hung up. 11 people came to my father's funeral. I know because I asked, much later, when I finally could stand to ask. The reading of the will was 3 weeks after that, in Grady Beam's office downtown, and I want to tell you what I expected walking in, because it matters to what happened next. I expected nothing. Truly nothing. I figured there'd be some tools, maybe the old flatbed truck. I was there because a lawyer asked me to be, and I'm the kind of man who shows up when he's asked. Grady slid a page across his desk. $4.1 million. My father had sold the feed operation to a co-op out of Missouri back in 2018, kept the land, kept the investments, and after everything, 4.1. And here's the part my brain did that I've turned over every day since. It didn't feel like money. It felt like proof. Because Grady read me the terms, and there weren't any. Every dollar, straight to me, no strings, no charity carve-out, no trust with hoops, no letter of apology required, nothing. Down to a coin collection in a shoebox. Down to a storage unit off Highway 97 he'd been renting for $22 a month since 2003. All of it. Mine. Clean. Now, I just spent the last 10 minutes telling you my father never forgave me for walking away from his business. Does that sound like a man who hadn't forgiven his son? I sat in that leather chair and the arithmetic started right back up, and I shut it down so hard and so fast I want you to picture it as a physical thing, like a door slamming on your own hand before you can pull it back. Because if he'd forgiven me any year in those 42, then all that silence wasn't something that happened to me. I did that. I built that wall same as him, brick for brick, and I'd spent 4 decades telling myself different. And there was a letter, sealed, my name on the front in his handwriting, which was always in pencil. Every scrap of paper that man ever wrote me was in pencil, because he kept a carpenter's pencil behind his ear until the day he died. Grady handed it across and said, "He gave me this about 1.5 years ago. Made me swear you'd get it directly, nobody else." And I said, "Thank you," and I put it in my coat, and I drove home, and I put it in the glove compartment of my Ford. 5 months. That envelope sat in that glove box for 5 months. I opened that glove box, I don't know, 300 times. For the insurance card, for a rag, for a lighter for the grill. Every single time, his handwriting looking back up at me. Now I've got to tell you about Carol Ann. My wife's out at a care home in Sapulpa, going on 3 years now. Early onset, they call it. She was 59 when we got the diagnosis. She's still in there, some days more than others. That's the part people don't get. She's not gone. She's in and out. Tuesday and Friday, every single week, 3 years running, and it was running us dry, financially, before my father passed. That's the other ugly truth about the money. It saved us. And I have never once let myself feel grateful about it, because being grateful for that money meant admitting what it was proof of. I told Carol Ann about it 2 weeks after the reading, sitting in that vinyl chair looking out at a parking lot, and I told her my father had died and left me $4 million, and she smiled and said, "Well, isn't that something, honey?" By Friday it was gone from her mind entirely. So I told her again. 5 months, twice a week, I drove out to Sapulpa and confessed the same thing to a woman who can't hold on to it. Do you understand what that is? That's not talking to somebody. That's a man walking into a room, setting something down, and picking it right back up on his way out the door. I told myself for a while that was love, that I refused to keep a secret from my own wife. Truth is, I picked her to tell because she'd never remember hearing it. All right. Denny Shirtliff, 29 years old, married my daughter this past spring. My daughter's name is Renee. She's 30, works as a parole officer downtown. And I want you to sit with that for 1 second. My daughter spends her whole working life deciding whether to trust men with records, whether somebody's changed or hasn't. And she's better at reading people than I am after 31 years in that courtroom. She gets that from me. That part's mine. I gave her that. Denny works nights at the American Airlines maintenance base out by the Tulsa airport, one of the biggest in the country, turning wrenches on jet engines from 11 at night till 7 in the morning. 6 years on that shift, going to Tulsa Community College part-time the whole way through on the company's dime, working toward his airframe certification. That's a real path plenty of guys around here take. Break your back all night and let the company pay for your degree 4 credits at a time. He's got about a year left. And I want to tell you the first thing I ever did about Denny Shirtliff, because it took me 20 minutes, and I've never said it out loud to another living soul. I ran him. You understand what that means coming from where I sit. A bailiff in that courthouse for 31 years knows every cop, every deputy, every clerk in 3 counties. I've stood 2 feet from 400 verdicts. I have a network built entirely out of other people's worst days, and every one of them owes me something they can't ever pay back. So I called a retired deputy named Ray Tolliver, a man whose mother's estate I helped him sort out years back, free of charge, off the books, because that's what you do for people. And I said, Ray, can you run somebody for me? And Ray and I want this on the record because it's the one decent moment in the whole first half of what I did, and it wasn't mine. Ray paused and he said, Walt, you sure you want me to run your own son-in-law? And I said yes. And he did it. 20 minutes. Public record mostly. Curtis Shirtliff, Denny's father. 5 years, 2007 to 2012, Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Embezzled about $70,000 over 3 years from a farm equipment dealership he managed. And there's a detail in there I'd like to skip past, and I won't, which is that it was a piece of farm equipment. My father sold feed. There's no connection there. None. They never met. Nothing links them at all. But my brain built one anyway, in about half a second, standing in a parking garage. That's the part I need you to understand about what I did next. It wasn't reasoning. It was a shape that fit, and my whole body said yes to it before I'd thought it through even once. Denny was 10 years old when his father went to prison, 15 when he got out. I learned that in 20 minutes, and it never once crossed my mind, not for a single second across 4 straight months, to wonder what that had done to a 10-year-old boy. Renee and Denny got engaged back in February, a full month before my father passed away. I need you to hold on to that timing, same as I have to. When Denny got down on one knee for my daughter, there was no inheritance sitting out there, no probate, no $4.1 million anywhere on the horizon. There was a 63-year-old bailiff with a mortgage, a wife in memory care burning through savings, and about 3 years of runway left before I'd have had to sell the house my father built. There was nothing, worse than nothing, and I knew that date. I knew it cold, and I built a case against that boy anyway, because once your mind decides something, the calendar gets soft and negotiable on you. I never once sat down and told myself an outright lie. I want to be precise about that. I just never once sat down and did the subtraction. The wedding was in April, out at a ranch venue near Broken Arrow, real pretty setup, and I paid for most of it, wired the deposit straight to the venue and the caterer myself. And Renee asked me 3 separate times, and I can still hear every one of them. She asked at the kitchen table, twice, and I said, Savings, sweetheart. Been putting it back for years. And once more, at the reception, during dinner, she leaned in and put her hand on my arm and said, Dad, seriously, where'd all this come from? And I looked at my daughter in her mother's old wedding veil and I said, Savings, honey. A long time coming. And she looked at me a second, and she said, Okay, Daddy, and she went back out and danced with her husband. Carol Ann came back to me for about 5 seconds in June. I've got to tell you this one. I was out at Sepulpa on a Tuesday, going through the $4 million story with her again, maybe the 100th time, and she was having a rough day, calling me by her brother's name, and I was just talking, mostly to the room at that point. And she turned her head and looked at me, and I mean she really looked at me. Carol Ann was there, all the way in, for the first time in probably 2 months, and she said, Did you go? 4 words. She wasn't asking one thing about the money, hadn't heard a word of it. Somewhere down under everything the disease had taken, she'd been holding on to exactly one question. And I said, No, I didn't go. And she looked at me another second and she said, Oh, Walt, that's all. 2 words, not angry, not even disappointed, exactly older than that. It was the sound of 38 years of marriage. A woman who knows precisely what her husband was always going to do and has already forgiven him for it, and it still costs her something every time. And then she asked what was for lunch, and she was gone again. Never came back to it. 5 months, twice a week, and that's the only 5 seconds I got. So then it's October, and Denny calls me on a Thursday, says he'd like to stop by Sunday afternoon, says he's got some paperwork he wants to go over. And I said sure. And I hung up the phone and stood there in my kitchen and felt something I'm ashamed to tell you about. Relief. 4 months of building this thing, Ray Tolliver, the printouts, dates on a yellow legal pad, and I'd started to worry it was all sitting in my own head for nothing. And then he called and said the word paperwork, and I thought, there it is. My daughter's husband said one word, and I was glad, because it meant I was right, and being right mattered more to me in that moment than my own kid's marriage. That's not a figure of speech. That's exactly what was sitting in my chest that Thursday. He came at 2 o'clock on Sunday, and he brought a man with him. I saw them through the front window before they hit the porch steps, and something in me went very still and very warm all at once, which is precisely what it feels like when you've been waiting on something for a long time. The man's name was Roland Beecher. 60s, works part-time as a notary out of the UPS store on Sheridan Road. Free service comes with the job, and I want you to hear this part because I didn't hear it myself until 4 months too late. That man wasn't some hired gun. He wasn't part of any scheme against me. He was a fellow from a strip mall who agreed to ride along because a young man he barely knew asked him nicely on a Sunday afternoon. He had his stamp and his little logbook in a canvas bag. They sat down at my kitchen table. I had my phone in my shirt pocket, recording, and I'd started it before I ever opened the front door. Denny set a folder on the table and said, "Mr. Odom, before anything else, I want to say," and I didn't let him finish that sentence. I said, "Denny, before you go any further, I want to tell you what I already know," and then I used the voice. You understand? I used the voice I built over 31 years, the one I use when a courtroom's about to come apart at the seams, and somebody needs to hear the worst news of their life delivered slow and level and warm, so it doesn't break them clean in half. I used the most careful instrument I own on a 29-year-old man at my own kitchen table, and I used it to take him apart in front of a stranger. That's the actual sin in all this. Everything else is just detail. I said, "Curtis Shirtliff, 5 years Oklahoma State Penitentiary, 2007. And I watched it land on him. His hands stayed flat on the table, didn't clench, nothing you could point a camera at. But there's a thing that happens behind a person's face. I've watched it 1,000 times from behind a bench where nothing moves but the pressure changes, like the air's been pulled clean out of a room. I said, $70,000 from a farm equipment dealer in Wagoner County. I said, "And you drove out here today with a notary?" And Roland Beecher's sitting at the end of my table with his little bag. And I watched Roland understand it too, watched a 60-some-year-old man who came out on a Sunday as a favor slowly figure out he was standing in the middle of something. And he got very small in that chair. He didn't leave, though. That's the thing. He sat there through the whole 11 minutes because he was too polite to get up, and I used that. I kept going because there was an audience and I wanted one. And Denny didn't say a word. That's what nobody who hears this story ever believes. He didn't defend himself, didn't say, "What are you talking about?" Didn't so much as raise his voice. He just sat there and let me do it to him. And when I finally ran out, and I want to be honest, I stopped because I ran out of file. Not because I was finished. There was about 6 seconds of dead air, and my son-in-law looked up at me and said, "Mr. Odom." I was 10. And I said something back, God help me, something about patterns repeating, and he said it again. I was 10 years old. And then he said the thing that's the whole reason I'm sitting here telling you any of this. He said, "You want to know the worst part? I've been carrying this since I was 10. Every landlord, every job application, every time somebody runs my name and finds my daddy's instead of mine." He said there was a woman at a car lot on Sheridan who looked at his license and said the last name Shirtliff out loud, and he watched her do the math, right there at the counter, and then quiet. And he said, "I'm 29 years old. I thought I was finished right about then. I thought that was the end of it." He'd built a whole life on that night shift, 6 years of 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., school on top of it, a wife, a year out from his certification, an actual life he'd built with his own 2 hands. And he drove out to his father-in-law's house on a Sunday afternoon and sat at a kitchen table and found out he was never going to be done paying for something he didn't do. Because it isn't on any paper. It's just something people do to you in 20 minutes with a phone in their pocket. And that's when the side door opened. Renee comes by most Sundays, has a key, brings groceries because she thinks I forget to eat since her mother went into the home. She was running late that day, caught maybe the last half a minute of it, standing in my kitchen doorway with a grocery bag still in her hand. And she said, "Dad." And I still had the momentum in me, still thought I was winning something. And I said, gentle as anything, in the voice, "Renee, honey, sit down, you need to hear this." And she set the bag on the counter and said, "What's in the folder?" And I said, and this is the sentence I'd put on my headstone if I had any say in it, I said, "It doesn't matter what's in the folder." And she said, "Dad, open it." And I didn't move. I want you sitting with me in that for a second. Because my own daughter told me to open a folder in my own house, and I froze solid. Because some part of me had already known for about 90 seconds. From the moment Denny said I was 10, some part of me had run ahead, looked inside, and come back, and told the rest of me not to, and I listened to that part. So, she opened it herself. Read for maybe 4 seconds. Set it down, turned it around, slid it across the table to me. It was a postnuptial agreement. Denny shirtless, waiving permanently and irrevocably, in the event of divorce, separation, or death, any claim whatsoever to the Odom estate, any inheritance, any asset, any interest of any kind. 3 pages, drawn up by a legal aid attorney downtown for $150, which I worked out later comes to about 14 hours on the night shift. He'd driven out to my house with a notary because he was giving something away, not coming to take it. He brought Roland Beecher from a UPS store on a Sunday so a rubber stamp could make it permanent and unbreakable, and I never let him finish a single sentence explaining that. Renee said, "Denny, go wait in the truck," and he went. Didn't look at me, didn't say a word to me. Took Roland by the elbow on the way out the door, and I saw him do it, that same careful hand-under-the-arm move I've used 1,000 times, steadying somebody in a courthouse hallway. Nobody ever taught him that. He just knew it. And then it was just my daughter and me standing in that kitchen. And she said, "Dad, I've known since March." And I said, "What?" And she said, "March, since before the wedding. 7 months, Dad." I said her name like a question and she kept going. She said, "It's public record. It's been on the county assessor's site since 3 weeks after Grandpa died. I looked it up myself." And she said, "Everybody already knows, Dad." Everybody. And I said, "No," like a child. I said it again. "No." And she said, "Aunt Loretta knows. Grady's secretary knows. Old man Yoder knows. He handled the funeral, Dad. Of course he knows. And Ray Tolliver knows. You had him run a background check on my husband. You think Ray doesn't know exactly why you called him? 7 months. She'd spent 7 months protecting a secret that was sitting on a government website the whole time. Everybody at church, everybody at the grocery store, all of them being quietly kind to me while I stood there thinking I was hiding something. That's what I couldn't get up off the floor from. Not the guilt, the embarrassment. And then she said the thing that finished me off. She said, "Do you know what I actually thought was going on?" And I said no. And she said, "I thought you were sick, Dad. 7 months, you come into money, you start lying to my face about where it came from, you won't look me in the eye. What was I supposed to think? I thought you had cancer. I thought you were quietly getting your affairs in order so you wouldn't ruin my wedding with it. I planned my entire wedding thinking my father was dying." And I said, "Why didn't you just ask me?" And she said, "Because I was waiting on you to tell me. 7 months, both of us 2 miles apart, waiting on the other one to open something first. She's her father's daughter, God help her." And then she picked her keys up off the counter, and she left the groceries sitting there, and she went out the same door she came in, and I sat down at that table with a folder and a phone in my pocket that was still recording. Came out to almost 2 hours of tape when it was done. I've never played a second of it back. Never will. I went out to my truck around 6 that evening. I don't even know why. I think some part of me meant to drive to Sapulpa and tell Carol Ann. Which, yeah, I know how that sounds. I sat in the driveway instead. Opened the glove box. 5 months of not opening that envelope, and I want to tell you what it's actually like to finally do it. It's nothing. That's the whole secret of it. Takes about 4 seconds. No music plays. My hands didn't shake one bit. I just put my thumb under the flap and it came open, because it was only ever an envelope, only ever a piece of paper sitting in a glove compartment the whole time. Carpenter's pencil. His handwriting hadn't changed one bit since I was a boy. 4 lines, and I'll give you every word of it because that's all there was. Walt, don't let them upsell you on the vault. It's a racket, and you of all people ought to know it. Everything's in order. Grady's got it. Dad. That's it. That's the last thing my father ever said to me. 42 years of silence and a man dies and leaves his only son a sealed letter. And it's a joke about a burial vault. I sat in that truck because do you understand what that letter actually was? He knew what an upsell on a vault was. He knew I'd know it better than most anybody in Tulsa County. Which means he'd been paying attention to what I thought about, quietly, from 2 miles away for years. That's a man who could not, physically could not, say the thing he needed to say, who had exactly one tool in his whole toolbox, a little joke about funeral costs, and he reached across 42 years with it, because it's the only thing he had in the truck. And I sat there and did the math I'd been dodging since February, and it took about 2 seconds. I don't know what casket he's in. 31 years standing 2 feet from grieving families, and I don't know a single detail of my own father's service, because I wasn't there. So, I called old man Yoder that night at his house, which you just don't do, and he picked up and said, "Walt?" And I asked him straight out what they'd put my father in, and there was this pause, and he said, "Hang on," and I heard him get up and go find the file at 8:30 at night in his own home, and he came back and read it to me. Said somebody Grady's secretary, a cousin. Nobody quite remembers who got talked into the upgraded vault at the viewing. Exactly like he'd warned me they would. Called it from the grave in pencil, and there was nobody in that room to stop it, because the one man in the whole state who'd have known better, who'd talked 400 families out of exactly that upsell over the years, was 2 miles away at home, not going. And I sat in my truck in my own driveway and I laughed, out loud, by myself, at nearly 9 at night. First time in 5 months. I don't know how long it lasted before it turned into the other thing, and I don't especially want to talk about that part. The storage unit. $22 a month since 2003, coming out on autopay the whole time, less than my cell phone bill, and I never once thought about it in 5 months. I went out there in November and I took Denny with me. I'd like to tell you that was some big moment of forgiveness. It wasn't. I called him and said, "I've got something out at a storage lot I can't face opening by myself." And he said, "Okay." And he came, because Renee told him to. I know that much. I'm not a fool. He came anyway. Cut the padlock myself with bolt cutters from my own garage, rolled the door up, and it was boxes. Maybe 25 of them, all the same, cheap file boxes, labeled in pencil. I opened the first one. Court dockets. Printed docket sheets from the Tulsa County Courthouse. My name typed at the bottom of every filing sheet where the presiding bailiff gets listed, going back to 1989. Hundreds of them. Every single box. Going back 30-some years. Denny stood behind me and said, "Mr. Odom, what is all this?" And I couldn't get a word out. My father had gone to that courthouse. He'd driven 2 miles, parked down the block, walked in, sat in the back of a gallery I'd stood at the front of 1,000 times, and watched entire trials just to see my name printed on a piece of paper. There's always somebody in the back of a courtroom gallery nobody looks twice at. I never once in 31 years looked twice at an old man sitting in the back. He was there. He'd been there for decades and I never saw him, or I saw him 100 times and thought nothing at all. Denny carried the boxes. That's how the whole thing ended, if you're waiting on some big scene. A 29-year-old man I'd run a background check on, and torn apart at my own kitchen table, carried 25 boxes of old court paperwork out of a storage unit in the cold, and loaded them into the bed of my Fox truck without me having to ask twice. When we were done, he said, "You want to grab something to eat?" And I said yes. Here's what all this taught me, and it isn't what you'd think, and I'd give plenty for it to be something else. I didn't keep that money quiet to protect my daughter. I've tried that story on for 7 months, and it doesn't fit. Never did. She's 30 years old with a phone and a login. She'd already found it out in March on her own. I kept it quiet, because as long as nobody knew about the $4 million, nobody could ask me the second question. And the second question is always, then why didn't you ever pick up the phone and call him? That's the real thing that money is. It isn't cash. It's a piece of evidence. A signed document proving a man left his only son everything he owned with no conditions attached whatsoever. And there's exactly one thing that can mean. And if that's what it means, then those 42 years of silence weren't something that happened to me. I built them. Alone, 2 miles away, 1 brick at a time. I've had a version of my own life running in my head since I was 22 years old, and it's a decent story, and there's a villain in it, and it isn't me. I've told that story at church suppers. I've told it to my wife 100 times before her mind started slipping. I've told it to myself in the shower more times than I could count. And there was an envelope sitting in my glove compartment the entire time that could take that whole story away from me in 4 seconds flat. So here's the thing I want to leave you with, and it's the real one. You don't put off opening something out of plain curiosity. Think about that for a second, because it's true. Nobody in the history of the world has ever left a letter sealed for 5 months just because they were curious what was inside. You only avoid the one you're scared of, and you're only scared of it if some part of you already knows exactly what's written there. The thing you won't open is the thing you've already answered for yourself, and you're just putting off hearing it said back to you. So here's what I'd ask you to do today, and it won't take you but a minute. Name the thing you're not opening. You already know which one. It came to your mind about 4 seconds ago, the second I said it, and how fast it came is exactly how you know it's the right one. A letter. A phone call you never returned. A box somewhere in a closet. A name you haven't said out loud in years. I'm not going to sit here and tell you to go open it. I took 5 months and I only opened mine because my own daughter shamed me into it. Just say out loud, to yourself, what you think is written inside. That's all I'm asking. Because whatever you just said, that's your answer. You've always known it. That's exactly why it stayed closed this whole time. And here's the one that actually got me, cousin. The one I'd leave you with if I only got to leave you one thing. What story about your own life would stop being true the second you opened that door? Because it was never really about the letter. It's never about the letter. If you're still with me, I want to hear from you, and I mean that sincerely. Tell me one if you think I did right. Keeping my guard up when a man showed up at my kitchen table with a notary and a folder there's an argument for it. Plenty of you would have run that same background check in my shoes. And if I'd been wrong about him, it would have been the most important 20 minutes of my whole life. Tell me, too, if you think it went wrong. The second my daughter said, open it, and I told her it didn't matter what was inside. I've replayed that sentence about 1,000 times now, and I still can't find a version of it. That isn't exactly what it sounds like. Tell me, 3, if you believe this whole thing was decided back in 1984, that a 22-year-old went and found himself a kinder father and spent the next 42 years calling it principle, and every bit of what came after the silence. The missed funeral, that glove box was just those same 9 minutes in a truck with the engine running, happening over and over, until one of us finally died. I'm a 3, cousin. Have been since about 9 o'clock that night sitting alone in my driveway. Tell me where you're watching this from and what time it is where you're at right now. I read every single one of them, and I mean that. It isn't just something I say. Tuesdays and Fridays out in Sapulpa, and the rest of it's just a lot of hours sitting in a quiet house. And here's the real question, cousin, the one underneath all of it. Is there somebody 2 miles from you right now, not across the country, not somebody you've got a good reason for? 2 miles? 20 minutes in the truck. Somebody where the only thing standing between the two of you is that neither one of you is willing to go first. Go first, please. I'm asking you plainly. It'll cost you about 11 minutes of your life, and I want you to look hard at what it cost me instead. And one more thing before I let you go. I told you at the start of all this that I'd be using the voice on you, and I did. The entire time, 31 years and 400 courtrooms worth of the calmest, steadiest instrument I own, and I used it on a 29-year-old man loading jet engines all night to build a life for my daughter. I don't have another voice. I've been looking for a different one for 5 months, and haven't found it yet. If you want to hear where this one goes next, stick around. I've got 25 boxes sitting in my garage, and I'm going through about one a week. There's a lot of them left. I'm going to be at this a while.